The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Oliver Whitaker had decided he was done with the bounty hunting business, and he read it twice before he crumpled it in his fist and thought about how the universe had a wicked sense of humor. The year was 1882, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man with one boot already out the door, restless, sun-baked, and perpetually on the verge of something violent. Oliver had ridden into Caldwell 3 days prior with a wanted man named Cleet Harrow tied to the saddle of a roan mare that wasn't even his, and he had collected his money from the sheriff's office with the kind of hollow satisfaction that had been growing hollower with every passing season. He was 28 years old, lean and dark-haired, with a jaw that had been broken once and set slightly wrong, giving him a look of permanent skepticism that women seemed to find either deeply attractive or deeply unnerving, depending entirely on their own dispositions. He had planned to drink 3 whiskeys, sleep until noon, and then ride south toward Texas with no particular destination in mind and no man's name on a piece of paper in his pocket. That had been the plan. The telegram was from a man named Gerald Prout, and Gerald Prout was, from everything Oliver had ever heard about him, the kind of man that other men crossed the street to avoid. He was a cattle baron out of Abilene with a string of properties stretching from the Kansas grasslands down into the Oklahoma territory, and he had money the way rivers had water, endlessly, effortlessly, and capable of drowning a person if they weren't careful. Gerald Prout had also, according to the telegram, recently lost his fiancée. Or rather, she had left. The telegram did not use the word escaped. It used the word departed, which Oliver thought was a polite way of saying the same thing. It said that Miss Charlotte Barrett, aged 24, had departed from the Prout estate in Abilene approximately 12 days prior, and that Gerald Prout was willing to pay $400, when the average bounty on a dangerous outlaw ran closer to 50, for her safe return. The telegram specified safe, and underlined it, which Oliver noticed but did not spend too long thinking about. He should have thrown the telegram into the fireplace of the Caldwell saloon and ordered his 3 whiskeys and been done with it. Instead, he read Gerald Prout's name again, thought about the $400, thought about the woman who had apparently decided that marrying Gerald Prout was worth running from, and then uncrumpled the telegram and folded it into his breast pocket. He told himself it was the money. He would tell himself that for quite a while. Oliver set out from Caldwell the following morning on his own horse, a big black gelding named Absalom, who had a white star on his forehead and the disposition of a creature that had long since made peace with everything the world intended to throw at him. Oliver had owned Absalom for 6 years, and there were days when the horse was the only company he could stand. He rode south and slightly west, following the logic of a woman running from Abilene. She would not have gone north into the open Kansas plains where she could be seen for miles, and she would not have gone east toward the more settled towns where someone might recognize her or turn her in for a reward. She would have gone toward the territories, toward the places where questions were considered rude and a person's past was their own business. He stopped in 2 small towns along the first day's ride and asked questions as casually as he could manage, describing a young woman traveling alone or possibly with someone she'd hired for the purpose, dark-haired or light-haired. He didn't yet know, moving with purpose or possibly with fear. In the first town, a dry goods store owner's wife shrugged and turned away. In the second town, a livery keeper scratched the back of his neck and said he thought a woman matching something like that description had passed through 4 or 5 days back, heading southwest, traveling with a gray mare and what looked like 2 saddlebags worth of supplies. She had paid for a bag of oats and a night in the stable and been gone by first light. It was enough. Oliver bought himself a cold supper and spread his bedroll under a cottonwood tree and lay listening to the crickets announce themselves to the dark Oklahoma sky, and he tried to build a picture of Charlotte Barrett from the fragments he had. 12 days gone, traveling alone, carrying supplies, heading southwest. She had planned this. This was not a woman who had woken up one morning in a panic and bolted without thinking. She had taken oaths. She had paid for a stable. She was moving steadily and quietly, not frantically, which told him she was either very brave or had been planning this for a long time, and he thought probably both. He fell asleep thinking about the kind of person who could plan an escape from a man like Gerald Prout and execute it cleanly. He caught up with her on the fourth day. He had not expected it to feel the way it did. He crested a low, red dirt ridge in the late afternoon, with the sun burning orange and low against the flat Oklahoma horizon, and he saw her below him at a creek bend, kneeling beside the water to fill a canteen, her gray mare standing placidly behind her cropping at the sparse grass along the bank. She had dark brown hair that she'd pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, but the hat had come off and was sitting on a rock beside her, and the late light caught her hair and made it look almost copper. She was wearing a plain calico dress in blue and white that had been practical rather than pretty once but was now both, dust-stained at the hem and belted at the waist with a leather strap that held a small knife. She was humming something to herself, low and absent, the way people hum when they don't know anyone is listening. Oliver pulled Absalom to a stop at the top of the ridge and sat very still for a moment. He had expected a frightened woman. He had expected someone who startled at shadows and wept at the sight of a stranger. He had not expected someone who hummed. He rode down the ridge slowly, making enough noise so she would hear him coming rather than be surprised, and she heard him before he was halfway down because she stood up immediately and turned around, and her hand went to the knife at her belt with a practiced swiftness that told him she had been expecting this moment even if she hadn't known exactly when it would come. He held both hands up where she could see them, reins loose in his left. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. She looked at him with brown eyes that were neither frightened nor particularly welcoming, and she said, "Everyone who is about to hurt someone says that first." "That's fair," he said. He kept his hands up. "My name is Oliver Whitaker. I ride out of Caldwell, Kansas. I was hired by Gerald Prout to find you." He had decided during the 4 days of riding that when he found her he would tell her immediately and plainly, because anything else was a kind of cruelty, and whatever else Oliver Whitaker was or wasn't, he tried not to be cruel. She did not run. She did not cry. She stood very straight with her hand still on the knife and looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and she said, "How much is he paying you?" $400. Something shifted in her face. Not fear exactly. Something more like the confirmation of something she had already suspected about the world. "400, she said quietly. "He must be very angry." "He must be," Oliver agreed. He lowered his hand slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, and he swung down from Absalom and stood on the ground because he had realized that being on horseback while she stood on foot was putting her at a disadvantage that he didn't want. "Miss Barrett," he said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to understand that your answer is going to matter to me." She watched him. Her hand stayed near the knife. "Then ask, why did you run?" She was quiet for a long moment. The creek made its sounds around them, and the mare shifted and blew through her nose, and the orange light moved across the red Oklahoma dirt. Then Charlotte Barrett said, "Because if I had stayed, there would have been nothing left of me within a year, maybe less." Oliver heard that. He heard it the way you hear a thing that arrives already shaped like the truth, with no ragged edges and no need for explanation. He nodded once slowly. "Did he hurt you?" he asked. Her chin lifted slightly. "Not the way you mean," she said. "Not with his hands, but there are other ways to reduce a person to nothing, and he was very skilled at those." Oliver turned and looked at the horizon for a moment, at the last burning edge of the sun sinking below the flat Oklahoma land, and he thought about Gerald Prout and the $400 and the telegram that had used the word safe and underlined it, as though safety were something Gerald Prout was concerned about delivering rather than extracting. He pulled the telegram out of his breast pocket and looked at it one more time. Then he looked at Charlotte Barrett. "I'm going to need to write a letter," he said. She frowned. "To whom?" "To Gerald Prout," he said. I'm going to tell him I didn't find you." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Charlotte Barrett stared at him, and he watched the calculation moving behind her eyes. She was smart. He could see that immediately, the kind of smart that had kept her alive and moving for 12 days across open territory alone, and she was trying to decide whether to believe him or whether this was some kind of trap. "You'd lose $400, she said. "I know. You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know a person who is running toward something rather than just running from it. And I know what kind of man sends a telegram with the word safe underlined, like he's the one who gets to define what that means." Charlotte's hand slowly came away from the knife. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression changed, softened just slightly at the edges, the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves off the sun. "What do you want in return?" she asked, because she was practical and had learned to ask that question. "Nothing," he said. Then he thought about it honestly and corrected himself. "Company, maybe, if you'll have it. I was heading south anyway, and I'd rather not ride alone." She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she picked her hat up off the rock and put it back on her head. "There's a town called Garfield's Crossing about 2 days' ride southwest," she said. "I was planning to stop there and look for work." "Then that's where we're going," Oliver said. He camped on the far side of the creek from her that first night, with a fire between them that they shared without ceremony, and they ate dried beef and hard biscuits from their separate supplies and said very little. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that 2 people settle into when they are still deciding what to make of each other, and Oliver found it easy rather than strained. He had lived most of his adult life in his own head, riding from one job to the next, and he had a natural tolerance for quiet that most people seemed to find strange. Charlotte Barrett, he observed, was not a person who felt the need to fill silences either. She ate her supper and fed her mare and stoked the fire once before she rolled out her blanket on the far side and lay down with her back to him. And within a few minutes, he could tell from her breathing that she was either asleep or very good at pretending to be. He lay on his back and looked at the Oklahoma stars and thought about the letter he was going to write in the morning. He had been composing it in his head during supper, turning the words around. He would tell Prout that he had tracked the lead to the southwestern territories and found nothing, that the woman had clearly passed through 2 or 3 towns and then gone to ground somewhere he couldn't find, that he was returning the advance payment. Prout had sent $20 with the telegram as a good-faith deposit, and that he was ending the search. He would keep it cold and businesslike. He would not apologize. He would send the letter from the next town they passed through, along with the $20, and after that the connection between Oliver Whitaker and Gerald Prout would be cleanly severed. He told himself the $400 didn't matter. In the dark, with the stars overhead and a woman sleeping 20 feet away who had hummed to herself at a creek bend in the Oklahoma evening, it was surprisingly easy to believe. In the morning, he woke to the smell of coffee. He sat up and found Charlotte already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire she had rebuilt, with a small tin coffee pot balanced on 2 rocks above the coals. She was wearing her hat and her practical blue calico dress, and she was reading something, a small, worn book that she held in both hands with the careful attention of someone revisiting something beloved. She didn't look up when he stirred. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. Oliver pulled on his boots and ran a hand through his hair and came to the fire, and she poured coffee into a tin cup without being asked and handed it to him, and he said thank you and drank it, and it was better coffee than he had made for himself in months. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover. It was a book of poems by Walt Whitman, the spine cracked and the cover worn smooth from handling. "My mother gave it to me when I was 16, she said. "I have carried it everywhere since." "Did you bring much with you when you left?" he asked, and then wondered if it was too personal a question, but she answered it without hesitation. 2 changes of clothes, the book. $47 that I had saved over 2 years from household accounts, a little here and a little there, because I knew Gerald watched the money and I couldn't let him see a pattern. She paused. A photograph of my mother, the knife, that was all. You planned it carefully, he said. I planned it for 14 months, she said simply. Oliver looked at her over his coffee cup. 14 months. She met his gaze steadily. Gerald Prout does not let things go easily, she said. I needed to be certain that when I went cleanly, with enough supplies and enough money to actually get somewhere. I needed a destination, even a rough one. I needed to leave in a way that bought me as much time as possible before he noticed. How did you manage that? A small, dry smile crossed her face. I left a note on my writing desk saying I had gone to visit a cousin in Topeka, she said. The cousin does not exist, but Gerald doesn't know that because Gerald never paid attention to the details of my life unless they were relevant to him. I calculated it would take him 3 or 4 days to discover the deception, then another few days to decide what to do about it. I was right about the first part. I may have underestimated his anger about the second. Hence the $400, Oliver said. Hence the $400, she agreed. They broke camp efficiently and without much conversation, both of them moving with the practiced economy of people accustomed to early mornings and travel, and Oliver noticed with something close to admiration the way she handled her mare, confident, gentle, no wasted motion. She had packed her saddlebags with real thoughtfulness, everything balanced and accessible, and she mounted with an ease that told him she had been riding since childhood. They rode side by side through the morning, the Oklahoma Territory stretching out around them in every direction in shades of red and gold and pale green, the sky immense and cloudless above. It was the kind of morning that made the open land feel generous rather than threatening, and Oliver found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months, the permanent tension he carried between his shoulder blades loosening almost imperceptibly. "Tell me about Garfield's Crossing," he said. "I've never been," she said. "I read about it in a newspaper article about 2 years ago. A woman had opened a dressmaking shop there and was doing well, and the article said it was a growing town with a steady cattle trade and a reasonable sheriff who kept good order. It seemed like the kind of place where a woman could find honest work without too many questions. What kind of work are you looking for? I can sew, I can cook, I can keep accounts, and I can read and write properly, which puts me ahead of a fair number of people in small western towns." She said this without arrogance, just as a statement of practical fact. "I would prefer work that uses my brain, but I am not too proud for any of it." "What did you do on Prout's estate?" The pause was brief, but she answered. "I was his fiancée," she said. Which in practice meant I managed his household staff, planned his social engagements, wrote his correspondence when he needed it to appear more educated than it was, and smiled at his guests. I was an extremely expensive and well-dressed piece of furniture. The bitterness in those last words was real but controlled, and Oliver heard the effort it took to control it. He didn't push further. "What do you want?" he asked instead. "Not just work. What do you actually want?" She looked at him sideways, a glance that was half startled and half something else, as though the question itself was unusual. And then she seemed to consider it genuinely, as though she were giving it thought she hadn't given it before, or hadn't allowed herself to give it. "I want a room of my own," she said finally, "with a window that faces east so I can see the morning. I want to be able to make my own choices about how I spend each day. I want to read my books without someone telling me that reading is unbecoming." She paused. "I want to laugh at things that strike me as funny without having to calculate first whether laughing is appropriate." She paused again. "That sounds small." "It doesn't sound small," Oliver said quietly. "It sounds like everything." She looked at him then fully, not just a sideways glance but a direct look, and something in her expression shifted again. He had the feeling of a door opening a crack. They rode through the midday heat and stopped at a shallow creek in the early afternoon to water the horses and rest in the shade of a line of cottonwood trees, and Oliver wrote his letter to Gerald Prout on a page torn from a small notebook he carried, using a pencil stub, sitting with his back against a cottonwood trunk while Charlotte read her Whitman in the dappled shade 10 feet away. He wrote it plainly. He had followed the lead southwest, found no reliable trace. The woman had clearly moved with care and covered her route. He was confident she had gone to ground beyond his ability to locate. He was returning the advance and considering the matter closed. He folded the $20 in with the letter and sealed the envelope with a strip of wax from the small travel kit he carried. When he was done, Charlotte looked up from her book. "May I read it?" she asked. He handed it to her. She read it carefully, her lips moving slightly, then folded it back along its creases and handed it over. "It's good," she said. "It doesn't over-explain. Over-explanation would make him suspicious." "I thought the same thing," Oliver said. "Have you done this before?" She asked. "Refused a job. Finished one poorly on purpose once," he said. "A man in Missouri wanted me to track his wife. I found her at her sister's house outside of Jefferson City. Left because he'd broken her arm in 2 places." He shrugged. "I told him I'd found nothing." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "Did he try to verify that?" "He threatened to," Oliver said. "I told him he was welcome to. He didn't." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What made you become a bounty hunter?" It was a reasonable question, and he found that he wanted to answer it honestly rather than with the short version he usually gave. "After the war there wasn't much," he said. "I was too young to have fought, but old enough to watch everything get reconfigured afterward. My family's farm in Missouri got caught between 2 different kinds of trouble during the Reconstruction years, and it went under. I had a good horse and I could shoot, and I was willing to go places that made other people nervous. It turned into a livelihood before it turned into an identity, and by then I wasn't sure how to separate the two." "Do you like it?" He considered the question seriously. "I liked the writing," he said. "I liked figuring things out, tracking a route, reading a landscape. I didn't like what I found at the end of most of them." He looked at the envelope in his hand. "I had been thinking, before your employer's telegram arrived, that it was time to do something else. And now I'm doing something else," he said simply. She smiled then, not the small dry smile from earlier but an actual unguarded smile, and it changed her face so completely that Oliver felt the impact of it somewhere in his chest, like a stone dropped into still water. He looked away before she could notice. They rode on through the afternoon and made camp at dusk in a natural hollow that gave them some shelter from the southwest wind, which had picked up and turned cool with the sunset. Oliver built the fire while Charlotte unsaddled the horses, and this time they cooked a proper meal. He had bacon and she had dried beans that she had thought to soak in water during the midday stop, and together they produced something hot and decent that they ate sitting close to the fire with the dark Oklahoma territory humming around them. "Tell me something about yourself that isn't the bounty hunting," Charlotte said. She was using her tin spoon to draw idle patterns in the dirt at the edge of the firelight, not looking at him, as though the question were casual. "I read," he said. "When I can get hold of books. I like history and I like science. I think about how things work, not just machines, though I'm interested in those too, but systems. How towns grow, how trails develop, why certain places become important and others disappear." She looked up with genuine interest. "You're curious." "Relentlessly," he said, and said it with enough self-awareness that she laughed. It was a warm laugh, lower than he had expected from the careful way she normally spoke, and he decided immediately that he would try to make her laugh again. "What was your family like?" he asked before Prout. Her face didn't close exactly, but it settled. "My father died when I was 15, fever. My mother held things together for a few years through sheer determination and a lot of help from the church community, but she got sick herself when I was 19 and things became difficult. Gerald Prout was a business acquaintance of my father's, and when my mother's situation became impossible, he presented himself as a solution." She said it evenly, as though recounting someone else's story. "He was generous at first. He paid my mother's medical bills. He was helpful and present, and he seemed from the outside like a man of substance and good character. And from the inside he was a man who believed that generosity was a transaction," she said, and that what he had bought with his generosity was the right to control everything in the house that bore his name, including me. She was quiet for a moment. My mother died the year before I left. She never knew. I think about that sometimes, whether it would have been worse for her to know or whether not knowing was a mercy. Oliver didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I think you gave her the mercy." "Even if it cost you." Charlotte looked at the fire. "I think so too," she said quietly, "but it's still a complicated thing to carry." "Most true things are," he said. She looked at him then with an expression he couldn't fully name, something that combined surprise with a kind of recognition, as though she had said something to him, and received back an answer she had given up expecting. On the second day of riding together, they reached a small settlement called Two Creeks, which consisted of a general store, a post office, a blacksmith, and 16 or 20 scattered houses that seemed uncertain about their relationship to each other. Oliver mailed his letter to Gerald Prout from the post office, pressing the $20 advance into the envelope himself and sealing it in front of the postmaster, and then he stood outside in the dusty street and felt something settle in him, clean and final, like the last piece of a lock clicking into place. Charlotte was at the general store resupplying, and he went in and found her examining bolts of fabric with the practiced attention of a woman who knew what good fabric felt like versus poor fabric, running her fingers along the edge of a length of dark blue calico and nodding slightly to herself. "Restocking?" he asked. "They have cornmeal and I was nearly out," she said. "And thread? I tore the hem of this dress yesterday on the sagebrush, and I haven't had a chance to mend it." He watched her make her purchases, negotiating the prices with a quiet authority that got her a fair deal without being aggressive, and he bought more bacon and a sack of coffee beans, and they loaded their saddlebags and rode out of Two Creeks heading southwest. The landscape changed slightly as the day went on, the flat Oklahoma grassland giving way to more rolling terrain, low red hills and deeper-cut creek beds and patches of blackjack oak that provided welcome shade. They rode at an easy pace, not hurrying, and talked more freely than they had the day before, the conversation moving between subjects in the natural way of two people who are discovering, with some surprise, that the inside of the other person's mind is interesting. Charlotte knew things. This became apparent and delightful to Oliver within the first hour of the day's ride. She knew the names of plants and could identify most of the wildlife they passed, the birds in particular. She had spent summers as a girl with an aunt who kept meticulous nature journals, and the knowledge had stuck. She knew history with a depth that surprised him, had strong opinions about Reconstruction and about the treatment of the Plains tribes, and she expressed them without hedging, which he found bracing. "The government's handling of the Indian Territory has been one catastrophe after another," she said at one point, as they rode through a stretch of land that had very recently been Comanche territory before the Medicine Lodge Treaty had reshaped everything. "They move people onto land and call it a solution, and then when the land turns out to have value, they move them again. And every treaty that gets broken is called a renegotiation, as though the original agreement was just a suggestion." "It's land and money," Oliver said, "which is the same story it's always been." "Which doesn't make it acceptable," she said firmly. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him as though checking whether he meant it or was just agreeing to agree. She seemed to decide he meant it. "Most men I've spoken to about this topic get uncomfortable very quickly," she said. "Most of the men I've ridden with in the territories would tell you the same thing I just said," he replied. "When you spend enough time out here, you see what it actually looks like. It's harder to be comfortable about it when it's not abstract." She nodded, and they rode in a silence that felt like agreement. That evening they camped near a stand of oaks above a small creek, and while Oliver tended the horses, Charlotte mended her dress hem by firelight with quick, practiced stitches, and then without ceremony she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a second, smaller piece of torn fabric and handed it to him. "Your sleeve has been coming away from the cuff since this morning," she said. He looked at his right sleeve and saw that she was correct. He hadn't noticed. He looked at her, surprised. "I notice things," she said simply, and held out her hand for the jacket. He gave it to her, feeling oddly moved by the small gesture, and she mended it with the same quick efficiency she'd applied to her own hem, and handed it back, and went back to her reading without comment. He put the jacket back on and held the mended cuff in his fingers for a moment before letting it go. In the firelight, with the night settling softly around them and the horses drowsing in the trees and the Oklahoma dark enormous above them, Oliver Whitaker began to understand that he was in significant trouble, and that the trouble was of the most wonderful possible kind. They reached Garfield's Crossing on the afternoon of the third day of riding together. It was a proper town, larger than Oliver had expected from Charlotte's description. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, several solid-looking frame buildings, a hotel with a fresh coat of white paint, a livery, 2 saloons, a church, a school, and several businesses including, as Charlotte had anticipated, a dressmaking and dry goods shop with a painted sign that read Henderson's Fine Sewing, established 1879. The town had the feel of somewhere that had decided to stay. The streets had boardwalks, and the buildings had glass in their windows, and there were women walking on the main street in ordinary afternoon commerce, which was always a good sign in a western town. It meant there was enough law and enough community that women moved freely. Charlotte sat straight in her saddle and looked at the main street with an expression that Oliver read as cautious hope, the kind a person allows themselves when they have wanted something for a long time and can finally almost see it. "It looks like what the newspaper said," she said. "It does," he agreed. They rode to the livery first and arranged for both horses. Then Oliver secured 2 rooms at the hotel. He asked for 2 rooms with the particular deliberateness of a man establishing a fact. And they brought their gear inside and had their first real wash in 4 days using the water basins in the hotel hallway. And then they went a fine supper. The hotel had a small dining room off the lobby, and it was serving beef stew and bread and apple pie. And they sat across from each other at a table with a red-checked cloth and ate real food in chairs like civilized people, for the first time since Oliver had found Charlotte at the creek bend. She had washed the trail dust off and combed her hair, and the lamplight in the dining room was warm and golden, and she looked across the table at him with an ease that hadn't been there 4 days ago, the wariness finally mostly gone from her eyes. She looked, he thought, like herself, like whoever she was when she was not being observed by someone who had an interest in editing her. "I'm going to visit Henderson's shop tomorrow morning," she said. "Good plan," he said. "I don't know if I should say who I am," she said, "whether to use my real name or not." He considered this carefully. "Prout hired 1 man," he said. "Me. I sent the letter. He has no reason to look in Garfield's Crossing specifically. There are 50 towns in this direction, maybe more, and he has no trail to follow. You could use your real name safely, I think, but if you're more comfortable with another name for a while, that's practical, not cowardly." She looked at her stew. "I don't want to be Charlotte Barrett who hides," she said. "I've spent 14 months hiding. I want to be Charlotte Barrett who left." "Then be that," he said. She looked at him with sudden directness. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. "You've lost $400 on my account. You could have taken me back. Even if you didn't want to, you could have simply ridden away and not ridden with me. Why are you still here?" It was a fair question. He met her eyes. "Because," he said, and stopped and started over. "Because when I saw you at that creek humming to yourself, I thought that's a person worth knowing." He said it plainly, without embellishment or apology. "And the more time I've spent with you, the more certain I am of it. So I suppose I'm still here because I'm not ready to stop knowing you yet." The silence that followed was warm. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, and the corners of her mouth turned up slowly, and this time when she smiled it reached all the way to her eyes, and he felt it in every part of him. "That's a very honest answer," she said softly. "I'm trying to be honest with you," he said. "You've had enough of the other kind." Her eyes were very bright in the lamplight. "Yes," she said quietly, "I have." They sat in the dining room long after the plates were cleared. drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular. The town, the weather, what they had seen on the trail, and Oliver noticed that the dining room gradually emptied around them, and neither of them suggested leaving. It was the proprietor's quiet cough of polite dismissal that finally got them out of their chairs. They stood in the hotel corridor outside their neighboring rooms, and Charlotte turned to him and said goodnight in a voice that was gentle and careful. And he said goodnight back, and she went into her room and he went into his, and he lay on the hotel bed in the dark for a long time with the smile still on his face. In the morning, Charlotte went to Henderson's shop and Oliver went to the sheriff's office, which was a practice he held to in every town. He spent more than one night in knowing the law was a habit from his bounty hunting years that he had not shaken, and it was generally useful. The sheriff of Garfield's Crossing was a woman named Dora Plank, which surprised him until he learned that Garfield's Crossing had elected her 3 years ago after the previous sheriff had absconded with the municipal fund and ridden north into Kansas, never to be seen again. Dora Plank was 45, solid and gray-haired, with a star on her coat and a revolver on her hip, and the manner of someone who had long since finished being surprised by anything. Oliver introduced himself and told her plainly that he was a bounty hunter by trade who was taking a break from the trade and traveling with a companion, and that he wanted no trouble in her town and simply wanted to pass through and remain in good standing. She looked at him steadily for a moment, then poured him coffee from a pot on her desk stove, and said that she appreciated people who came in and introduced themselves honestly, and asked him to stay for a few minutes. They talked for 20 minutes about the county, the cattle trade, the state of things in the territory. She mentioned without particular emphasis that she had no outstanding warrants for anyone in her jurisdiction, which Oliver read as a gentle way of establishing that she was not in the market for bounty hunters' services, and he nodded to show he understood. He asked about work, not bounty hunting, other work, something that used his particular skills but didn't require him to be in the business of bringing people back to places they didn't want to go. Dora Plank looked at him with those steady eyes for a moment. "There's a cattleman named Horace Webb about 8 miles east of town," she said. "He's expanding his operation, and he's been looking for a ranch foreman since March. Experienced man good with horses can manage a crew and handle trouble if it comes. The pay is fair and there's a small house on the property." She paused. "If you're thinking about putting down." Oliver rode back to the hotel and found Charlotte already returned from Henderson's, sitting in the small lobby with an expression that he could read even from the doorway. "They hired me," she said. He sat down in the chair across from her. "What are you doing?" "She needs an assistant," Charlotte said. "Margaret Henderson, the woman who owns the shop. Her apprentice got married in April and moved to Wichita, and she's been managing alone since then. I showed her my sewing, and she asked me 3 or 4 questions about accounts, and I told her what I knew about managing accounts, and she said she could pay me $6 a week, and there's a room above the shop that she's been using for storage that she's willing to clear out and rent to me for $2 a week. That leaves you $4 a week," he said. "Which is more than I've had in a long time," she said, with a light in her eyes that he had not seen before. She looked young like this, in the lobby with the morning light coming through the window, with something that was almost wonder on her face. "Oliver, I have a job. I have a place to live. I have—" She stopped and her voice was a fraction unsteady. "I have it. What I was trying to get to, it's here." He felt something so warm in his chest that he had to swallow before he could speak. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm genuinely, completely glad." She looked at him then with eyes that were wet at the corners, and she reached across the short distance between their chairs and put her hand briefly over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, just for a moment, just a gentle pressing of her fingers over his, and then she took it back. But the warmth of it stayed on his skin like a brand. He told her about Dora Plank and Horace Webb in the foreman position, and she listened carefully, and when he was done she said, "Will you go and speak to him?" "I thought I would," he said. "Today, if possible." "I think you should," she said. and then carefully measuring the words. "I think you should stay in Garfield's Crossing, Oliver." The way she said his name, he had been Oliver to her since the first morning over coffee, and she was Charlotte to him. No formalities between them since the first day. The way she said it had a particular quality, an intentionality, as though she were placing it deliberately in the sentence in the spot where it would carry the most weight. He went to see Horace Webb that afternoon. Webb was a broad, weathered man of 55 who had the look of someone who had built everything he had with his own hands, and was therefore deeply selective about who he trusted to work alongside it. He interviewed Oliver for 40 minutes, asking practical questions about cattle management, horse handling, managing ranch hands, conflict resolution, weather reading, all the pragmatic business of keeping a cattle operation running in the Oklahoma Territory. Oliver answered honestly and completely, including the parts about bounty hunting and why he was done with it. Horace Webb looked at him for a moment when he finished. "I don't care much what a man did before, as long as what he did before left him with skills that are useful to me now and didn't make him into someone I can't trust," he said. "I've talked to enough men to know which I'm looking at." He paused. "You can start Monday. The house needs work, but it's sound, and there's a barn for your horse." Oliver rode back to Garfield's Crossing with the hired hand's satisfaction of a decision settled, and he thought the whole way back about the small room above the dry goods shop and Charlotte Barrett arranging it to her own liking, with a window that might or might not face east. The following days fell into a shape. Oliver spent his days at the Webb Ranch learning the operation, the cattle, the hands, the rhythms of the land and work, and rode back to Garfield's Crossing in the evenings. And most evenings he found some reason to be near Henderson's shop, which was on the main street, 3 blocks from the hotel where he was still staying while he fixed up the small house on Webb's property. Charlotte was always working. She was precise and fast with her needle, and she had a gift for fitting that Margaret Henderson told her plainly was unusual. The ability to look at a person and understand immediately how a garment needed to be adjusted to suit the specific shape of that specific body. And within the first week she had 3 women of the town coming back as regular customers, which more than justified her wages. In the evenings, after the shop closed, they walked. This was how it developed. Not a dramatic declaration, not a formal arrangement, just the natural gravity of 2 people who found each other's company more interesting than any available alternative. They walked the length of Garfield's Crossing's main street and out to the edge of town, where the cattle land opened up and the big sky came back, and they talked about everything. About what they had seen on the trail and what they were seeing now. About books and history and the strange, ongoing conversation of the American West with itself. About her mother and his family. About Gerald Prout once carefully, because Charlotte needed to say some things aloud that she had been carrying, and Oliver listened without trying to fix anything, because he could tell that what she needed was not fixing but witnessing. "He told me once that I was lucky," she said. They were standing at the edge of a field east of town, the evening warm and purple-blue around them. That most women in my position would have had no options, and he had given me options, and I should be grateful every day. And for a long time I believed him, because when someone says a thing like that confidently enough and often enough, you start to hear it as fact rather than as their version of events. "How did you start to hear it differently?" "Slowly," she said, "and then all at once." One evening at one of his dinner parties, there was a woman, a visitor, a friend of one of his business partners, and she said something that made me laugh, a genuine laugh, and I saw Gerald's face when he heard it, the expression. "That calculation I told you about." She paused. "And I thought, if I have to calculate whether I'm allowed to laugh, then what he calls luck and what I call luck are 2 entirely different things. That was when I started planning." Oliver said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He will never find you here." She looked at him. The purple evening light made her face luminous. "How do you know that?" "Because I am very good at disappearing trails," he said, "and I made sure yours doesn't exist. The letter I sent him points in exactly the wrong direction. Even if he hired someone else, and I doubt he will because Gerald Prout's pride will make him want to believe that you've simply vanished, that you're not somewhere thriving. Even if he did, there is no trail from Two Creeks to Garfield's Crossing. You rode off-road. You didn't sign your name anywhere. You're here under your own name, which is common enough, in a town that has no reason to connect itself to anything in Abilene. She breathed. It was the slow, conscious breath of someone releasing something they had been holding for a long time. "I believe you," she said. "Good," he said. She turned to look at the open land, and he stood beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and they watched the last of the evening light fall back behind the rolling Oklahoma hills. "Oliver," she said. "Yes. I am glad you were the one he sent," she said. "I know that is a complicated thing to say, but I am glad." He turned to look at her profile against the darkening sky. "I am glad I was sent," he said. She turned then and looked at him directly, and the distance between them was very small, and Oliver Whitaker, who had never in his life been uncertain about what he wanted in any practical situation, was suddenly, profoundly, beautifully uncertain about whether the next thing he wanted to do was the right thing to do yet. He did not do it. He was careful with her. He understood, without her having to explain it, that a woman who had spent years with a man who made her calculate her own laughter needed time to simply be without needing to calculate anything. He would not rush it. He was a patient man when patience mattered. He said good night and walked her to the door of the shop and rode back to his temporary room at the hotel. And he lay in the dark again with the same smile he'd been wearing since the dining room, and thought about patience, and found it easier than he expected. October came to the Oklahoma Territory with bright cold and the smell of wood smoke and frost, and Oliver finished his work on the small house on the Webb property so that it was habitable, a proper bed, a proper stove, the windows reglazed with new glass, a rocking chair he had traded labor for at the Garfield's Crossing carpenter shop, placed on the small porch that faced west toward the sunset. Charlotte came to see it on a Sunday afternoon when he had finished it, riding her gray mare out along the road to Webb's ranch while he worked, and she stood in the doorway of the house and looked at the one main room with the bed in the corner and the stove in the center and the small table and the bookshelf he'd built against the east wall, and she said, "You built a bookshelf." "I had the lumber left over," he said. She walked to the shelf and ran her finger along it, empty and clean. "It's lovely," she said. It was a simple sentence, but she said it with a depth that made it about more than the shelf. She turned around and looked at the room and at him, and then she said, "May I give you something for it?" He frowned, not following. She opened the saddlebag she'd brought in from her horse and took out 3 books, not her Whitman, which she kept for herself, but 3 others, clearly selected with thought. A history of the American West, a book of natural science, a novel he hadn't read by a writer he'd heard of. "For the shelf," she said, "so it has a beginning." He took the books from her carefully, and their fingers overlapped on the spines, and neither of them moved for a moment. He looked at her face, which was very close, and she looked back at him, and this time he could read her clearly enough. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not an answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. It was simply an agreement with something that was already true. He kissed her gently, barely, his hand coming up to her face with such care that it almost felt like a question, and she answered it by not pulling away, by leaning into it slightly, by putting one hand against his chest where his heart was going faster than he would have preferred to admit. When they stepped back from each other, she was looking at him with those clear brown eyes, and she said, "I have wanted you to do that for approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks," he said. "Since the second evening at the fire when you said that what I wanted sounded like everything," she said firmly. "So you have been very slow." He laughed. It was a full, warm laugh, and she laughed with him, and the small house felt full of something good. They rode back to town together in the golden October afternoon, their horses side by side, and the conversation was easy and warm, and Charlotte reached over once and touched his arm with her hand just briefly as they rode, just to touch, and he covered her hand with his for a moment before they had to separate their horses for a narrow part of the trail. November deepened and the Oklahoma winter came seriously, cold and clear, the sky scrubbed to a sharp blue by the northwest wind. Oliver's work at the ranch shifted from outdoor work to the indoor labor of winter equipment repair, inventory, planning for spring, and he found he liked the specific purposeful rhythm of each season's work, the way there was always something that needed doing and the satisfaction of doing it well. Charlotte had become, by November, something of an institution at Henderson's shop. Her reputation for fitting had spread through the surrounding farms and ranches, and on Saturdays the shop was regularly busy with women coming in from beyond the town, and Margaret Henderson had given her a small raise at the end of October and told her she was indispensable in the particular tone of a woman who did not give compliments lightly. Charlotte had also, quietly, begun teaching. A woman named Rosie Calvert, who cleaned at the hotel, had mentioned to Charlotte one evening that she had 3 children who would be school-age next year, and she was worried because the county school was 6 miles away, and the road was not reliable in winter, and she couldn't afford to keep them home. Charlotte had said cautiously that she knew how to teach, not formally trained but educated, genuinely educated, and within 2 weeks there were 4 children coming to the back room of Henderson's shop on Thursday and Friday afternoons, learning to read and cipher and write with Charlotte Barrett as their teacher. Oliver brought her candles for the back room, because the light was poor in the afternoons. He said it was practical. She looked at him with that half-smile that he had catalogued thoroughly by now and said, "You are the most quietly thoughtful man I have ever met." "I'm just practical," he said. "You are not just practical," she said. "You are kind, which is different and better." He had learned to receive her directness without deflecting it. He said, "Thank you, Charlotte." She reached up and touched his jaw briefly, the broken, slightly wrong-set jaw that gave him his look of permanent skepticism, and traced the line of it with her fingers, gentle and precise, the same way she handled the finest fabric, and he closed his eyes for a moment. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said. "It did once." "Most things that's set wrong do," she said quietly, "and then they're just the shape of you." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and thought that he was entirely and irrevocably in love with Charlotte Barrett, and that this was the best and most obvious fact of his life, and he had no idea why he had spent 28 years without it. He proposed on a Thursday evening in December. He had thought about how to do it with more careful attention than he had given most things in his life. He had a ring, not a new one, not a purchased ring, but his mother's ring, which he had carried in his saddlebag for 6 years without quite knowing why. A thin gold band with a small seed pearl that was modest and perfect. He had taken it out the previous evening and cleaned it with a cloth and thought about his mother, who had been a practical, warm, funny woman, and thought that she would have liked Charlotte Barrett enormously. He did not make it into a performance. Charlotte would not have wanted a performance. He did it the way most things between them were done, which was directly and honestly in the small house on the Webb property. On a Thursday evening when Charlotte had ridden out with a basket of food she'd prepared, because she had announced 2 weeks ago that she was going to make sure he ate properly, which he received as the extraordinary gift it was. She was cutting bread at the table and he was putting more wood in the stove, and he turned around and said, "Charlotte." She looked up. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and took the ring out of his pocket and showed it to her in his palm. He said, "I am not the most elegant man in the world and I don't have a speech prepared, but I have this ring which was my mother's and I have been carrying it for 6 years without knowing who it was waiting for, and now I know. It was waiting for you." He paused. "I love you. I would like very much to spend the rest of my life making sure you have a room with a window that faces east and shelves full of books and the freedom to laugh at anything that strikes you as funny. Will you marry me?" Charlotte put down the bread knife. She looked at the ring in his palm. Then she looked at his face, and her eyes were full but not spilling, and she said, "Yes, Oliver. With my whole heart and without a single reservation, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, the small pearl in the lamplight, and then she put both her arms around his neck and he held her close, her cheek against his shoulder, and she said into his collar, "I need you to know that the morning at the creek, when you came down the ridge with your hands up, I thought you were going to be one more disaster. I was so tired. And then you said you just wanted to ask me something and that my answer would matter to you, and I thought, who is this person?" He laughed, his chin resting on the top of her head. And now I know exactly who you are," she said, "and it is the most magnificent thing." They were married in late February of 1883, in the Garfield's Crossing Church on a Wednesday afternoon that was cold and bright, with a thin, crystalline winter sun laying silver light across the snow that had come the previous week, and not yet fully melted. The church was small and white-painted, and it smelled of wood smoke and pine, and the pews held most of the town because Garfield's Crossing was a town that took its celebrations seriously. Charlotte wore the dress she and Margaret Henderson had made together over the preceding month, a deep blue wool, beautifully fitted, with cream lace at the cuffs and collar that she had embroidered herself in the evenings, working by lamplight with the patience and precision that was simply the way she did everything she cared about. She walked down the short aisle with her hand on Horace Webb's arm, because Horace had offered to stand for her since she had no father, and he had done it with gruff, genuine care. Oliver stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had bought for the occasion, his hair combed, his jaw shaved clean, and he watched Charlotte walk toward him with the full, quiet attention of a man who knew exactly how lucky he was, in the particular way that you can only know a thing like that when you have understood how easily it might have been otherwise. When she reached him, she looked up at him with steady brown eyes and a smile that was entirely her own, and he took her hand and held it, and the minister spoke the words that had been spoken in all the frontier churches before this one, and Oliver and Charlotte said theirs in clear, unhurried voices. Dora Plank was there, sitting in the back row with her star on her coat, and she nodded at Oliver when he looked back down the aisle after the ceremony, a short nod that conveyed a considerable amount for a woman who ran a tight economy of expression. Margaret Henderson wept, which she had told Charlotte firmly she would not do, and did anyway, and Charlotte had told her she would and had given her a handkerchief in advance, which Margaret had called presumptuous and used gratefully. They had a wedding supper at the hotel dining room, a long table pushed together to hold 20 people, and there was roast beef and apple cider, and a cake that the hotel cook had made at Charlotte's request in the style her mother used to make. Plain yellow cake with a brown sugar frosting that Charlotte said was the best thing she had eaten since she was 12. Oliver watched her across the table as the evening went on, watched her laugh at something Rosie Calvert said, watched her reach over to help one of the children who had come, small Ruth Calvert, 6 years old, who had attached herself firmly to Charlotte over the preceding months and had been permitted to attend the supper as a special occasion, watched her catch his eye across the table and smile with that specific warmth she kept for him, and he thought, this is what the whole preceding story was for. They spent the first months of their marriage in the small house on the Webb property, and Oliver added to it as the spring came in, building a second room that would serve as Charlotte's reading and sewing room, with a window that faced east. He put it in the plans without telling her, and she came one Saturday to find the framing up, and she stood looking at the half-built window frame in the east wall and said nothing for a moment, and then she turned to him with eyes very bright and said, "You remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," he said. She crossed the distance between them and kissed him in the way that she had developed since their marriage, thoroughly and without ambiguity, and he thought about patience again, and how it had absolutely, completely, without question been worth every day. By the time the east room was finished, with its window and its larger bookshelf and its good light in the mornings, Charlotte had something to tell him that made the window and the east-facing light and the space of the room matter even more. She told him one evening in March in the kitchen, in the same direct and clear way she told him everything, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he put his face in his hands, and she heard the sound that came through his hands, and she put both arms around him from behind and held on. He turned around and held her face in both hands and looked at her and said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "Is everything is fine," she said, with the smile that had become the most familiar and beloved sight of his daily life. "I am healthy and well, and I saw the doctor in town last week to be certain. Everything is fine, Oliver." He pulled her close and held on, and she laughed against his chest, and he laughed too after a moment, the particular helpless laugh of a man who has found himself in the middle of something so much larger and better than anything he had planned. Their son was born in October of 1883, on a morning that was bright and sharp with the first cold of autumn, with the cottonwoods along the creek already gone to gold. Horace Webb's wife, a quiet, competent woman named Eleanor, had come to assist at Charlotte's request along with the town doctor, and Oliver had been sent outside to wait, which he did by walking in circles around the house for 4 hours, and then simply standing still in the yard, looking at the sky and making every kind of promise to every kind of power that might be listening. When Eleanor opened the door and told him to come in, he went in and found Charlotte in the bed with her hair loose around her shoulders and her face exhausted and radiant, and a small, red-faced, furiously indignant creature in her arms. "Come and meet him," she said. Oliver sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was approximately 4 hours old and already appeared to have opinions, and Charlotte watched Oliver's face and held the moment the way she held all the best things, with full, conscious attention, letting it go all the way in. They named him James, for Oliver's father. James Whitaker grew his first months in the small house on the Webb property, which grew around him. Another room, a proper porch across the front, a kitchen garden that Charlotte tended with the same precision she gave everything, a small vegetable plot that Oliver dug in the spring and which produced magnificently that first summer in the way that first-year gardens sometimes do, as though the earth itself is welcoming you. Charlotte kept teaching, 3 afternoons a week now, with a growing roster of students and a letter that had arrived in late spring from the county school board, written in response to a petition that Dora Plank had quietly organized among the families whose children Charlotte taught, asking if the informal school might be formalized. Charlotte had written back with her terms, which were fair and clearly articulated, and 2 months later she had a formal position as the Garfield's Crossing teacher, with a proper salary and a schoolroom that the town agreed to build by the following autumn. Oliver had watched her read that letter 3 times, and the 4th time he saw her put it down and press her hand flat against the table, steadying herself, and he said, "Charlotte." She looked up at him. Her eyes were very bright. "I'm officially a teacher," she said, in a voice that shook only at the edges, "with a salary." He came to where she was sitting and crouched down so they were level and took her hands in his. "You have been officially a teacher since October," he said. "The county just caught up." She laughed, and he stood and pulled her up into his arms, and she wrapped her arms around him and said into his shoulder, "I never told you how terrifying it was those first weeks. That something would go wrong and I would lose it. That someone would find out where I was, or that the work would fall apart," or she stopped. "I am learning to believe in things. You can believe in this," he said into her hair. "It's real, all of it is real." He had heard nothing from Gerald Prout. He had listened for it carefully the first months, the way you listen after a fire for the sound that means it isn't fully out, but there had been nothing. He thought about it sometimes, what it meant that a man like Prout had let it go. He suspected that pride was involved, the particular pride that prefers to believe that something lost wasn't worth the keeping, rather than acknowledge that it had chosen to leave. He thought Charlotte was right that the word escaped was too honest for a man like Prout. Once, in the spring of 1884, a stranger came to Garfield's Crossing, a man with the look of someone in the business of finding people, that particular watchful cast to the face that Oliver knew from his own mirror. Oliver watched him from the window of the ranch office, noted the direction of his questions, and went that evening to speak to Dora Plank, Dora said she'd already noticed him. She said she'd spoken to him that afternoon and asked his business, and he had said he was passing through on the way to Texas, which she did not believe, and she had told him plainly that Garfield's Crossing had no outstanding matters, and she was not aware of any business he might have in her town, and she suggested he keep riding. He had ridden out the following morning. Oliver told Charlotte that evening, simply and without drama, so that she would know and not be surprised. She listened and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you think it was Prout?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "It might have been unrelated, but if it was, nothing came of it, and Dora will watch for it." Charlotte sat with the information. James was asleep in the east room, and the house was warm and full of firelight, and she had a piece of sewing in her lap that she was not currently working on. "I am not afraid," she said carefully. "I want you to know that I am not afraid. I have been afraid for a long time, and I am tired of it." "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "You are not alone." She looked at him across the firelight. "No," she said softly, "I'm not." Nothing more came from Gerald Prout that spring or any spring following. Oliver heard a year later, through the general drift of news that moved along the Kishom Trail, the way news always moved in the West, person to person, saloon to courthouse to dry goods store, that Gerald Prout had become engaged to the daughter of a Denver banker, and a year after that they had married. He did not tell Charlotte this immediately. He thought about it for 3 days first, and then he told her, because he did not keep things from her, not even things that required a careful setting down. She looked at him for a moment when he told her. Then she said, "God help her." "Yes," he said. "Is there anything to be done?" He thought about this honestly. "She's in Denver, not in a territory where a woman has few options. She has a family that will be watching. It's not the same situation." He paused. "But I'll keep my ears open." Charlotte nodded and went back to what she was doing, and he watched her settle back into the rhythm of her evening, and he thought that she had handled that with a grace that cost her something, but that she carried well, the way she carried most things. The schoolhouse was built in the autumn of 1884, and Charlotte moved her classes into it the following January. And the spring term of 1885 she had 22 students ranging from 6 to 14. And she taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, and a little natural history and geography. And she did it with the same attentive precision she gave everything, with full respect for the fact that these children were thinking people and not vessels to be filled. Rosie Calvert's eldest daughter, who was now 9 and ferociously clever, asked Charlotte one afternoon why girls didn't get to do the same things as boys, and Charlotte sat with that question for a moment and then said, "There are some people who believe they should not, and those people are wrong. There are some structures in place that make it harder, and it is one of the things we should work on changing." Rosie's daughter thought about this and said, "How?" Charlotte said, "By being very good at what you do, and very loud about your right to do it, and by teaching your daughters the same." Oliver heard about this from Rosie Calvert herself, who told him in the general store with considerable pride, and he went home and told Charlotte, and she shrugged and said, "It's simply what I think," and he said, "I know," and kissed her forehead, and she leaned into it. James Whitaker walked at 11 months, ahead of schedule by anyone's accounting, which Charlotte observed with the combination of delight and wary readiness of a mother who understood that early walking was a beautiful development with significant logistical consequences. He talked from around 14 months, which Horace Webb's wife Eleanor said she had never seen before, and Oliver thought about Charlotte's books and Charlotte's voice reading them, and thought it made complete sense. The spring of 1886 was remarkable for many things, but primarily for Charlotte coming to Oliver one morning with a look he recognized, a look he had first seen when she told him about James, and sitting down at the breakfast table and saying, "I want to tell you something." He sat down across from her. "Tell me." "We are going to need a bigger east room," she said. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the east window, exactly as he had intended it when he built it, falling across the table and across her face, and she was 28 years old and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with who she was, and he thought for the 10,000th time that he was the luckiest person he had ever met. "A bigger east room," he said. "Or perhaps an additional room entirely," she said serenely, and sipped her coffee. Their daughter was born in November of 1886, in the same room where James had come into the world, and they named her Rose, for Charlotte's mother, which had been Charlotte's mother's middle name, and which Charlotte had been keeping aside privately for the right occasion. She was smaller than James had been at birth, dark-haired and calm, with an apparent equanimity toward the world from the first hours that would prove to be her characteristic disposition throughout her life. James, who was 3, investigated his sister with the concentrated scientific attention of a small person conducting field work, and declared her acceptable, which Oliver felt was a reasonable verdict. Oliver added a proper second room off the east side of the house that spring, larger than the current one, with 2 windows, one east, one south, and Charlotte moved her reading chair and her books into it and arranged them the way she wanted them. And Oliver built 2 more shelves because the first ones were full, and the children grew in the house that kept growing with them, solidly and with purpose, the way good things do. The years settled in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, because life in the Oklahoma Territory in the 1880s was not without difficulty. The winters were hard, and the cattle business had its cycles of boom and trouble, and the land made its own demands. But with the fundamental sturdiness of 2 people who had chosen each other well and who continued, each day, to make the same choice. Oliver became known in the county as a man you could trust with a problem, which led to Dora Plank asking him twice to handle specific situations that required someone who was capable but not carrying a badge, and he did it both times with the old skills and the new judgment, and came home to Charlotte, who asked questions and listened to all of it. Charlotte's school grew. By 1888, she had 3 dozen students and had written to the county board for assistance with a second teacher, and the county had provided one, a young woman from Missouri who was sharp and willing, and Charlotte had the specific pleasure of watching someone else come into this work with the same combination of nervousness and determination that she had brought to it 3 years earlier, and shepherding that carefully. She also, by 1888, had begun writing. She had started sending letters to 2 newspapers, one in Kansas City, one in Abilene, on the subject of rural education and the needs of frontier schools. The letters were published, which surprised her the first time and did not surprise her after that. They were good letters. They were clear and well argued, and they dealt with a real problem in the West that was not being adequately addressed. And by the second year, she had a regular correspondence relationship with the Kansas City editor, who told her that her letters got more reader responses than most of his professional contributors. Oliver read every one before she sent them. Not to approve them. She did not require his approval, but because she wanted to read them aloud to him and hear them herself, and because he was her best audience, which she told him plainly and which he received as the honor it was. By 1889, when Oklahoma Territory was open to homesteading in the Great Land Run of April, Garfield's Crossing was already firmly established, and Oliver and Charlotte owned their land outright. Oliver having purchased the parcel from Horace Webb 3 years earlier, when the old man had begun thinking about retirement, and had offered his foreman a price he considered fair. They had 8 acres around the house and barn, and a share in the cattle operation that Oliver continued to manage, and it was theirs in the full, clear sense of the word. In the autumn of 1889, Oliver came home one evening to find Charlotte sitting at the kitchen table with 2 envelopes in front of her. She looked at him when he came in with an expression he read as careful, the expression she wore when something required being approached thoughtfully. "These came today," she said. "The first is from the Kansas City newspaper. They would like me to write a monthly column on education in the Western Territories, for which they will pay me $3 a column." Oliver sat down. "That's significant," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I'm going to accept." She said it with the confidence of a woman who had learned to trust her own decisions, which was one of the most beautiful things Oliver had watched happen over the preceding years. She pushed the second envelope toward him. "This one is from Abilene." He picked it up. He did not need to open it to understand what it might be, but he opened it and read it, and then he put it down carefully. It was from a woman named Miriam Holt, who described herself as Gerald Pruitt's wife of 2 years. She had, by means Oliver chose not to investigate too closely, found Charlotte's address, probably through the newspaper correspondence, he thought, or through someone who had connected Charlotte's name in print with the Garfield's Crossing teacher. She wrote that she was in a difficult situation and that she had heard, through sources she did not specify, that Charlotte Barrett had once been in a similar situation and had found her way out of it, and she did not know who else to write to. Oliver set the letter down and looked at Charlotte. Charlotte had already read it. She was watching him. "I know," she said. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to write back," she said. "I want to tell her she has options. I want to tell her what they are specifically, and I want to tell her that if she decides to use them, there are people in the world who will help her and not bring her back." Oliver looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the creek bend in Oklahoma, the late orange light, the woman who had been humming. He thought about Gerald Pruitt and the word safe underlined in a telegram. He thought about the telegram still in his memory, the $20 sent back in an envelope with a letter pointing in the wrong direction, and the rest of the money never earned and never missed. "Then write back," he said. She nodded. She pulled paper toward her and uncapped her pen and began to write. And he got up and put more wood in the stove and put a kettle on for coffee, and came back and sat across from her while she wrote, reading his own book in the warm kitchen light, both of them occupied and quiet and entirely together. Charlotte wrote to Miriam Holt with the full, direct generosity of someone who understood what it was to receive useful information at the right moment. She gave her specific options and specific contacts, lawyers, women's organizations that had been growing through the decade, practical information about resources. She told her own story briefly and without drama, as an illustration that it was possible. What happened to Miriam Holt after that was her own story, not Charlotte's to tell. What Oliver and Charlotte knew was that a reply arrived 2 months later, short and written in a hand that still trembled but carried a clarity in its words. She had left. She was with her sister. She was safe. She was grateful. They read it together at the kitchen table, and Charlotte put the letter in the box she kept for things worth keeping, and Oliver put his hand over hers on the table, and they sat for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have done a good and right thing. The 1890s came in and the Oklahoma Territory changed around them, as it was always changing, the frontier moving west and south, towns growing, the railroads coming, the landscape of the possible shifting and expanding. James Whitaker, who was 7 in 1890, was his mother's son in his love of books and his father's son in his love of the land and horses, and he moved through both worlds with an ease that Oliver watched with admiration. Rose Whitaker, at 3, was already revealing herself to be a person who had exactly as many opinions as Charlotte and approximately twice the willingness to express them immediately, and Oliver adored her absolutely and completely. Oliver turned 35 in 1889, still lean and dark-haired but with more lines at the corners of his eyes and a permanent tan from the years of Oklahoma sun. And he had the quality that some men develop in their 30s of looking more themselves than they ever had before, as though the face has finally settled into its actual meaning. Charlotte at 31 was extraordinary, and he told her so regularly, and she received this with the self-possession of someone who has stopped evaluating themselves through borrowed lenses and arrived at their own assessment, which she found both more accurate and more interesting. On a warm evening in June of 1891, they sat together on the porch of the house. The front porch now ran the full width of the building, with 2 proper chairs and a swing they'd bought from a traveling salesman who had excellent taste, and the children were asleep inside, and the Oklahoma evening was violet and warm around them with the sound of the night birds coming in from the pastures, and Charlotte leaned her head against Oliver's shoulder. He put his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about that creek," she said, "where you found me." He pressed his lips to her hair. "What about it?" "I think about it sometimes," she said. "How close it was to going differently. What would have happened if you had been a different kind of man?" "I was planning to be a different kind of man," he said. "I had been for years." She lifted her head and looked at him. "What changed it?" He looked at her face in the evening light, the brown eyes and the line of her jaw and the woman she was, all of it, the sum of every conversation and every evening and every morning and every day of the years between that creek and this porch. "You were humming," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, and it was the laugh he had been collecting for years, warm and full and completely her own, and he was 40 years old in his heart in that moment, which is to say he was full. She settled back against his shoulder, and they sat in the evening until the stars came fully out above the Oklahoma territory, the big democratic sky of the West that had no ceiling and no walls and belonged to everyone equally, and the night birds called from the pastures, and inside the house, their children slept in their beds, and the books were on the shelves where they belonged, and the east window showed its frame of dark sky, and everything that was meant to be settled was settled. Charlotte Barrett had run from the man she was trapped by, and Oliver Whitaker had been sent to bring her back. He had found her at a creek bend in the Oklahoma evening, humming. He had sent the money back and kept riding beside her, not ahead, not behind, but beside. And they had ridden, both of them, all the way here, to this porch, to this life, to these children sleeping inside, to the shelves full of books that had started with 3 volumes placed on empty wood as a gift, to the east window and the morning light it was designed to catch, to the letters that were changing things, slowly and then less slowly, to the students who were learning to be loud about their rights, to the quiet, powerful dailiness of 2 people who had chosen each other with full information, and no illusions and endless, renewable certainty. Oliver Whitaker looked at the stars and thought that the telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day he had decided he was done with bounty hunting, and the universe had indeed had a wicked sense of humor, and he was grateful for it every day. Charlotte reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder and laced her fingers through his. He held on. The night birds called. The stars turned. Everything was exactly, completely, and permanently well.